Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to remark, Mr. Barr, that your family is showing a prodigious level of patience, indefatigable endurance, and that should be marked for the record. You're a very lucky man. You know that about 30-plus states have legalized medical marijuana or adult use. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes.
In 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole Memorandum, which provided guidance to U.S. attorneys that the federal marijuana prohibition should not be enforced in states that have legalized marijuana in one way or the other. Do you believe it was the right decision to rescind the Cole Memorandum?
My approach to this would be not to upset settled expectations and the reliance interests that have arisen as a result of the Cole Memoranda, and investments have been made, and so there have been reliance on it. So I don't think it's appropriate to upset those interests. However, I think the current situation is untenable and really has to be addressed. It's almost like a backdoor nullification of federal law. To me, it's a binary choice. Either we have a federal law that applies to everybody.
And so I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but how would you address that?
Well,
do you think it's appropriate to use federal resources to target, marijuana businesses that are in compliance with state laws?
No, I said that. Yeah. That's what I said. I'm not going to go after companies that have relied on the Cole Memoranda. However, we either should have a federal law that prohibits marijuana everywhere, which I would support myself, because I think it's a mistake to back off on marijuana. However, if we want a federal approach, if we want states to have their own laws, then let's get there, and let's get there the right way.
And if you don't mind, I'm going to just move on. But it's good to hear at least the first part of what you said. During your previous 10 years Attorney General, you literally wrote the book on mass incarceration, or at least wrote this report, The Case for More Incarceration. You argue that we as a nation were, quote, incarcerating too few criminals.
In those days.
And that the solution was more incarceration for more people.
Excuse me.
Please, sir.
For chronic violent offenders and gun offenders.
Well, I mean that's the challenge, sir. And you argued against the bipartisan legislation in 2015 quite strenuously.
I did.
But that's not the nature of incarceration in this country. In fiscal year 2016, only 7.7% of the federal prison population was convicted of violent crimes. Overwhelmingly, what was initiated in those times that led to an 800% increase in the federal prison population, overwhelmingly, that was nonviolent drug offenders. Right now, our federal prison population is overwhelmingly nonviolent. 47.5% of the federal prison population are incarcerated for drug offenses. And I guess hearing your arguments then and hearing your arguments against the bipartisan legislation that we brought out of the committee in 2016.
But Senator, I think that's wrong, what you just said, okay? I think when you have violent gangs in the city, killing people, murder and so forth and so on, sometimes the most readily provable charge is their drug trafficking offenses, rather than proving culpability of the whole gang for murder. So you can take out a gang on drug offenses, and you could be taking out a lot of violent offenders. Do you think that the murders in Chicago are they're related to gangs, and including gangs involved in
and sir, and again, and we can get into the data if you'd like, and I'd like to get some more pointed questioning. But this is the sort of these are sort of the tropes that make people believe that in inner cities we should have such profound incarceration rates. And I'd like to ask you specifically about that data, because I think it's language like that makes me kind of concerned and worried. You said you hadn't reviewed, you said earlier in your testimony you hadn't reviewed criminal justice data about this actual issue of incarceration versus non-incarceration. I just want to know, will you commit to commissioning a study on just the concerns that we're talking about right now about the efficacy of reducing mass incarceration and publish those results? Would you be willing to do such a study yourself?
Well, no, as I understand it, I've been told that there's a lot of data to support the First Step Act.
Yeah, and that First Step Act goes directly towards addressing a lot of the problems we've had in mass incarceration. And so if you're saying that it is necessary to deal with violence in communities by over-incarcerating, here's a bipartisan group of senators that's working towards reducing mass incarceration. And that's why I think it's very important, which I appreciate you saying you didn't know because you hadn't reviewed the data. I think it's very important that you review the data and understand the implications for the language that you're using, which brings up this language of race, which is often not said explicitly, but when you talk about Chicago in the way you just did, it brings up racial fears or racial concerns. And you stated that if a black and a white, this is quoting you directly, are charged with the same offense, generally they will get the same treatment in the system and ultimately the same penalty. You previously quoted, and I quote you again, there's no statistical evidence that there of racism in the criminal justice system. Do you still believe that?
No, what I said was that I think that's taken out of a broader quote, which is the whole criminal justice system involves both federal but also state, local justice systems. And I said there's no doubt that there are places where there is racism still in the system. But I said overall, I thought that as a system, it's working. It's not predicated on.
So can I press you on that? Overall, the system treats blacks and whites fairly. From my own experience, I've lived in affluent communities. I've gone to the college campuses with you. There are certain drug laws applied there that's very in which I live. But let's talk stats. Let's not talk our personal experiences. And so I've sat with many of my colleagues and many conservatives who readily admit what the data shows. And so I have a whole bunch of reports which I'll enter into the record from nonpartisan, bipartisan groups, even conservative leaders talking about the rife nature of racial bias within the system. For example, the federal government's own data, the U.S. Sentencing Commission's research shows that federal prosecutors are more likely to charge blacks with offenses that carry harsh mandatory minimum sentences than similarly situated for whites. The federal government's own data shows that black defendants were subject to 3-strike sentencing enhancements at a statistically significantly higher rate, which added, on average, over 10 years to their sentences. And so with numerous researchers having found stunning racial disparities rife throughout our system and in the federal system, which you will be the chief law enforcement officer of, and primarily overwhelmingly for drug laws. For example, I don't know if you're aware or not of the Brookings study that found that blacks are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested for selling drugs, despite the fact that whites are actually more likely to sell drugs in the United States of America, and blacks are 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for possession of drugs when there is no difference racially in America for the usage and possession of drugs in the United States. I don't know if are you familiar with the Brookings study?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so just a follow-up, will you commit to commissioning a study examining racial disparities and disparate impacts of the policies that you talked about and that led to mass incarceration, the policies that you defended when you criticized the bipartisan 2015 sentencing reform legislation? Will you commit to, at least as the most important law enforcement officer in the land, to studying those well-documented racial disparities and the impacts it has?
Of course I'll commit to studying that, and I'll have the Bureau of Justice Statistics pull together everything they have, and if there's something lacking, I'll get that, and I'm interested in the state experience. But when I looked at this, I think 1992 was a different time, Senator. The crime rate had quintupled over the preceding 30 years, and it peaked in 1992. And it's been coming down since 1992.
And sir, I just want to tell you, I was a young black guy in 1990s. I was a 20-something-year-old and experienced a dramatically different justice system in the treatment that I received. Okay. And the data of racial disparities and what it's done to black communities, because you literally said this about black communities, and I know that your heart was in the right place. You said that, hey, I want to help black communities. This is what you're saying. The benefits of incarceration would be enjoyed disproportionately by black Americans living in inner cities. You also said that, quote, a failure to incarcerate hurts black Americans most.
And I'll tell you what's...
And I just want to ask you a yes or no question, because I have seconds left. Do you believe now, 30, 40 years of mass incarceration, targeted disproportionately towards African Americans, harsher sentences, disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, with the American Bar Association talking about once you've been incarcerated for even a low-level drug crime, There are 40,000 collateral consequences that impact your life. Jobs, Pell Grants, loans from banks. Do you think, just yes or no, that this system of mass incarceration has disproportionately benefited African-American communities? Yes or no, sir?
I think the reduction in crime has since 1992, but I think that the heavy drug penalties, especially on crack and other things, have harmed the black community. The incarceration rates have harmed the black community.
And I would just conclude to my chairman and partner, thank you, sir, on this, because I'm really grateful for this bipartisan group, the Heritage Foundation. I've spoken at the AEI conference, just found such great partnership, but I worry about the highest law enforcement officer in the land and some of the language I still hear you using that goes against the data, and that you're going to be expected to oversee a justice system that you and I both know needs the faith and confidence of communities that has dramatically lost that confidence because of implicit racial bias. And the DOJ, and I'll give you a chance to respond, the DOJ itself has said, mandated implicit racial bias training, and I hope that's something that you will agree to do. But this is the thing I'll conclude on, is that we live on a planet Earth where you can tell the most about a nation by who they incarcerate. In Turkey, they incarcerate journalists. Thank God we don't do that here, even though they've been called the enemy of the people. In Russia, they incarcerate political opponents. I'm glad we don't do that, even though with chance of lock her up. But you go into the American criminal prisons, sir, and you see the most vulnerable people. You see over-stigmatized mentally ill people clogging our system. You see over-stigmatized addicted people clogging our system. You see a system where, as Brian Stevenson says, it treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And you see disproportionately, overwhelmingly for drug crimes, African Americans and Latinos being incarcerated. The importance of your job, and I'll ask you this last question, because you haven't met with me yet, you've given that courtesy to others. Would you please meet with me in my office so you and I can have a heart-to-heart on the urgency, the cancer on the soul of our country's criminal justice system is the disproportionate impact of that system on those vulnerable communities, including women, over 80% of whom the women we incarcerate are survivors of sexual trauma. Can you and I sit down and have a longer conversation than these 10 minutes will allow on this issue?
I'd very much welcome that, Senator. You know, my experience back in 1992, when sort of blood was running on the streets all over the United States, my ideas were actually first formed when I went to Trenton. And the African-American community there essentially surrounded me and was saying, look, we're in our golden years. We're trying to enjoy our golden years, and we can't even go outside our house. We have bars on our house and so forth. Please, these gangs are running roughshod. So I developed this idea called weed and seed. And my attitude was, look, let's stop arguing past each other on let's attack root causes and let's get tough on crime. And I felt that for programs to work, like after-school programs and so forth, for all this, you know, for housing projects to be safe, we needed strong enforcement in those communities, and we needed those other programs to be brought to bear community by community. And it had to be done with the leadership of the community, and that was this idea of the partnership. And it caught on. It was very popular, and in fact, it was continued by a lot of the U.S. attorneys in the Clinton administration after the Bush administration was out. And it is actually, under a number of different names, has continued. So I'm very conscious of the issues you raise, but my goal is to provide and my motivation was to provide safety in these neighborhoods for the people trying to raise their children and for the older people and so forth. And I think the neighborhoods are, you know, the crime rate has gone down. I make a distinction between the way we treat these chronic violent offenders and the drug penalties. The drug penalties, as I said, very high and draconian, and in some cases that might have been necessary, but I supported revisiting the penalty structure.
And sir, I'm the only United States senator that lives in an inner city, low-income community. I've had shootings in my neighborhood. A young man killed last year on my block with an assault weapon. I know this urgent need for safety and security. And I'm not saying I'm necessarily going to vote for you one way or the other, but I believe your intentions are well. But I think that some of the things you've said in the past lead me to believe that your policies might be misguided in the way that Mike Lee and Cornyn and Graham and Grassley have been incredible partners in changing the American reality. I hope that you can be that kind of partner too, and I hope that you and I can have a good heart-to-heart conversation, trusting that we both want the same end for all communities, safety and security, but a justice system that is fair to all American citizens.
I'd welcome that.
Thank you, sir.
Hi everyone, my name's Mike. I'm the creator of Mox News, and for the last 15 years I have been telling you that as long as I have the support of the community that I serve, Mox News will post videos forever. And that's the truth. As long as I have your support, no one could ever make me stop. Unfortunately, currently, less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of Mox News viewers ever donate, tip, or contribute anything back. Again, let me make that really clear. Much less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% ever give anything back. And to those of you who have donated to Mox News, I want to thank you so much, because it's because of your generosity that we have been able to bring attention to important videos that millions and millions of eyes would have never seen. And I think that that's an amazing thing that we've been able to make happen together. And I can't thank you enough for helping me make that happen. So it's not too late. If you'd like to see Mox News covering the 2020 presidential election, if you can't imagine the 2020 presidential election without Mox News, please, there's still time. You can make a difference. It's easy to make a contribution, donation, or tip. You can go to moxnews.com, or in the text body of this video, there are clickable links to the Patreon page or to the PayPal page. And again, it should take less than 2 minutes to make a donation, and your donation can make a big difference. So I thank you all. Stay cool. One of these days this war is going to end, and it would be awesome if Mox News could be there to celebrate that day with you.